There is a particular kind of quiet that belongs only to water moving slowly in the dark. Not the hush of an empty room, and not the stillness of a held breath, but something softer than either of those, something that seems to breathe on its own. You may have heard it once without knowing it. Perhaps it was the sound of rain slipping off a leaf outside a window you had forgotten to close, or the faint murmur of a gutter after a storm had passed, or the small, companionable trickle of a kettle beginning to settle on a cold stove. Water that is going somewhere, unhurried, asking nothing of you. Water that has been moving like this for longer than anyone alive can remember, and will go on moving long after the lamp beside you has been switched off, and the room has cooled, and the day has finally loosened its hold on your shoulders. Tonight, we are going to sit beside that kind of water. We are going to follow it down the green flank of a mountain, through stone channels carved by hands that belong to people whose names we will never know, past small shrines wrapped in checkered cloth, and the faint sweet smoke of incense, into fields that lie flat and silvered beneath the moon like stepping stones for the sky. We are going to walk, very slowly, through a landscape where the line between a prayer and a piece of engineering has always been drawn in flowing water, and where farmers have, for more than 1,000 years, measured their kindness to one another in fingers' widths of a stream. The island is Bali. The quiet task ahead of us is to understand the gentle, patient genius of the Subak, the sacred irrigation system that has shaped its rice terraces since long before any of us were born. Let the room settle around you now. Loosen whatever needs loosening. Let your shoulders drop a little further than you thought they could. The night is long, and it is generous, and there is nowhere at all that you need to be except here, beside the soft and endless sound of a mountain giving its water to the fields below. To begin, we have to climb. Not with our feet, but with our imagination, up into the high green center of the island, where the volcanoes sit wrapped in cloud. Bali is a small place, only about 5,000 square kilometers of land shaped like a gentle diamond, cast into the warm sea between Java and Lombok. But its skyline is dominated by a row of sleeping giants. Mount Agung, the highest, rises more than 3,000 meters into the air. Beside it stand Mount Batur and Mount Badukaru and several smaller peaks, and together they have done something extraordinary for the island below them. Their slow ancient eruptions, century upon century, have laid down layers of mineral-rich volcanic soil, soft and dark and almost impossibly fertile. And into that soil, the monsoon rains fall heavy and reliable, gathering into lakes, sinking into springs, emerging again as rivers that tumble southward toward the coast. A line of volcanoes, a warm, wet climate, and a patient ocean of soil. The stage was set, long before anyone arrived to notice it, for something to grow. At the heart of the high country lies Lake Batur, a crater lake held inside the caldera of the volcano that shares its name. It is a quiet, elongated mirror of dark water, ringed by cliffs and by the slow movements of mist in the early mornings. For the Balinese, this lake has always been understood as the ultimate source of every spring and every river on the island. It does not matter whether a particular stream can actually be traced back to it through the rocks. The knowledge is older and softer than geography. Water comes from the lake. The lake belongs to the goddess. The goddess gives the water to the people. And so the people in turn give something back. It is a conversation that has been going on for 1,000 years and more, and the first voices in it were the voices of farmers. They began, as far as anyone can tell, in the 9th century. The exact date is lost, the way most beginnings are, but an inscription from the year 1071, carved during the reign of a king called Marakata, already speaks of the Subak as if it were an established and familiar thing. By then, the practice of carving the hillsides into terraces and drawing water down through them in carefully governed channels had been going on for generations. Some scholars believe the roots stretch back even further, into the Austronesian tradition that the first settlers carried with them across the sea. What is certain is that by the time the great temples began to rise, the Subak was already the quiet heartbeat of the island's agriculture, the rhythm by which the rice was grown. The word itself, Subak, names two things at once, and this doubled meaning is important to hold gently in the mind. A Subak is a physical thing, a stretch of land with its canals and its fields and its small shrines. But it is also a community, a cooperative of farmers who share a single source of water and have agreed, through generations of conversation and adjustment, to care for that source together. A Subak might have 50 members. It might have 400. It might be small enough for everyone to know everyone else by the color of their sarong in the dusk, or large enough that you would only see some of its members at the great seasonal ceremonies. Each one has its own name, its own history, its own pattern of fields. And each one is bound to every other Subak on the island by the simple, unarguable fact that they all drink from the same mountain. Picture, if you would, a terrace in the early part of the day, when the light is still soft and the air has not yet warmed. The water in the paddy is so still that it holds the sky inside itself, a thin layer of pale gold above the dark mud. A heron stands somewhere at the edge, patient as a carving. Small frogs call from under the leaves of the young rice plants, and the plants themselves, no higher than a child's hand, trace their pale green lines across the water in rows, so even that they seem to have been drawn with a ruler. A farmer walks slowly along the narrow earthen bund between two paddies, barefoot, feeling the firm coolness of the mud through the soles of his feet. He carries nothing heavy. He is simply checking. He is looking at the level of the water, the color of the rice, the behavior of the small life around the stalks. He is the inheritor of a quiet science that began long before his great-grandfather's great-grandfather, and he moves through it the way you might move through a familiar room in the dark, knowing without looking where every corner is. What makes the Subak more than a clever piece of hydraulic engineering? What has caused it to endure for so many centuries and to be recognized by the wider world as something unlike any other farming system on Earth is the philosophy it grew out of. The Balinese call it Tri Hita Karana, which translates, gently, as the three causes of well-being or the three sources of goodness. The idea is simple, though it takes a lifetime to live well. Harmony, the teaching says, comes from three relationships. The relationship between people and the divine. The relationship between people and other people. And the relationship between people and the natural world. All three must be kept in balance for life to flourish, and no one of them can be sacrificed for the sake of the others without the whole arrangement quietly beginning to crumble. The Subak is, in a very practical sense, Tri Hita Karana made visible in the landscape. The water comes from the gods and passes through their temples before it touches the fields. The fields are shared, and their care is decided in meetings where every farmer has a voice. And the forests above the springs are left alone, protected, because they are the lungs and the kidneys of the whole system, the place where the rain is caught and cleaned and held before it is let go. And so the water begins its journey. It seeps from a high spring in the shadow of Mount Badukaru, or slips out of the caldera of Batur, or rises into the sunlight at some small, mossy opening in the rock where a few polished stones mark the place. The first thing it meets is not a pipe or a gate but a prayer. A small temple has been built there, perhaps only large enough for a single priest to sit beside it comfortably, and the water has been blessed before it is allowed to move on. This is the way the whole island begins to drink. Not from a reservoir, but from a greeting. The walk from that first spring down to the lowland fields can take many hours if you were to follow every twist of the water. Along the way, you would pass through forests where the trees lean close overhead, and the light comes down in green-tinted fragments, and you would hear the water before you saw it, a steady whispered conversation between itself and the stones. Here and there you would come upon a weir, a low wall built across the stream to divide its flow, and you would see how the water, instead of being forced or dammed, has been gently coaxed into two paths, then three, then more. At each division, a simple opening has been cut into the barrier. The size of that opening is not arbitrary. It has been agreed upon, sometimes centuries ago, by the Subak that the water belongs to next. In the old way of measuring, these openings were described in teka, or in fingers' widths, a quietly human unit. 2 fingers for one field, 3 for another, so that each farmer receives water in proportion to the land he is entrusted with, and no one takes more than his share. You could stand at one of these weirs for a long time, watching the water slip through the cut stone, and find yourself thinking about all the arguments that have not happened here, all the jealousies that have been settled before they could even begin, because someone, long ago, chose to measure kindness in fingers. From the weir, the water enters a canal, and from the canal it may enter a tunnel. The Balinese have been boring tunnels through hillsides for the sake of their fields for as long as anyone can remember. Some of them are short, only a few meters of dark passageway cut through a ridge. Others run for hundreds of meters underground, through the living rock, dug by patient hands holding simple iron tools and guided by nothing but a knowledge of the slope of the land and a stubborn faith that water would eventually come out the other side. When you stand at the mouth of one of these old tunnels and hold your hand over the opening, you can feel the cold breath of the mountain coming out to meet you, and you can hear the water somewhere inside, still moving, still doing the work it was given in a century no one now remembers. It is a small wonder in a landscape full of larger ones, and it belongs to no single great engineer, no celebrated architect. It belongs to a village. It belongs to a Subak. By the time the water reaches the terraces themselves, it has already been shared many times. It enters the highest field, fills it gently, then passes through a small opening in the mud wall and tumbles a short distance into the next field down, and then the next, and then the next, in a slow, patient staircase of flowing water that can contain hundreds of steps before it reaches the bottom of the slope. Each paddy is a small artificial pond, and each pond is a small world. In the morning, egrets come to fish the edges. In the afternoon, dragonflies hover above the surface in iridescent quiet. Ducks are sometimes driven through the just harvested fields to eat the grain left behind and to fertilize the mud for the next planting. And all the while, the water keeps moving. It does not sit still long enough to stagnate. It does not rush so fast that it carves the walls away. It has been taught, over many generations, exactly how to behave. The farmers have taught it, and the priests have taught it, and the temples have taught it most of all. Because the water, before it ever arrives at a single rice plant, has already passed through a whole hierarchy of shrines. At the very top of this hierarchy, standing on the rim of the Batur caldera nearly 1,500 meters above the sea, is a temple called Pura Ulun Danu Batur. Its name means, simply, the temple at the head of the lake, and it is regarded as the supreme water temple of the island, second in importance only to the great mother temple of Besaki on the slopes of Mount Agam. It was not always in its current position. The original temple stood much lower, near the shore of Lake Batur itself, nestled into the caldera. But in 1926, the volcano stirred in its sleep, and a flow of lava came down the mountain and engulfed the village of Batur and most of the temple compound with it. Almost everything was lost. Almost. The 11-tiered main shrine, the tall, slender Meru with its stacked black thatched roofs reaching up into the sky, survived. The villagers took it as a sign. They carried what they could salvage up to the higher ground on the rim of the caldera, and there they rebuilt the temple patiently over the next several years. It is still there. You can visit it now and find 9 different temple compounds within the single complex, holding together hundreds of shrines devoted not only to Dewi Danu, the goddess of the lake, but to the gods of springs and rivers, of agriculture, of arts and crafts, of every small thing that requires water to flourish. Dewi Danu is a name worth holding in the mind for a moment. She is the goddess of the lake, yes, but she is also the goddess of all fresh water on Bali. Every spring, every stream, every paddy is in some sense her domain, a small outpost of her mercy. Her temple on the rim of Batur is her principal residence, and the high priest who presides there, known as the Jiro Jid, has for centuries held a role that is as much practical as it is spiritual. It was he, and not any king, who historically set the calendar of planting for the whole island. When the priests of Ulun Danu Batur decided that the time had come for a particular cluster of Subaks to flood their fields and sow their rice, word traveled down the slopes through the network of lesser water temples, and the farmers obeyed. This was not a matter of superstition. It was, in its way, a very efficient form of ecological management, though no one would have used those words to describe it. By coordinating the timing of the plantings across entire watersheds, the temple priests broke the life cycles of the pests that preyed on the rice. Plant all the paddies at once, and the insects would find plenty to eat. Plant them in waves, and the insects would starve between harvests. Leave a whole section of the slope fallow at the right time, and the water could be concentrated where it was needed most. This is the part that has astonished the outside world, when the outside world has finally paid attention. In the late 20th century, an American anthropologist named Stephen Lansing came to Bali to try to understand how the Subak system actually worked, and he and his colleagues eventually ran computer models of the water temple network to see whether its decisions could be improved upon by modern science. The models, after thousands of simulations, arrived at the same planting schedules that the priests of the water temples had been using for centuries. The temples, in other words, had already solved the problem. They had solved it with nothing more than meetings, ceremonies, and the quiet authority of a goddess who lived inside a volcano. The story of how this came to be understood by the wider world is, in its own way, a gentle one. For most of the 20th century, the Subak was treated by outside experts as a quaint survival, a pretty piece of folklore wrapped around what was really just a primitive irrigation system. In the 1970s, a wave of well-meaning agricultural reformers arrived on the island with new rice varieties and bags of fertilizer and schedules of planting that ignored the temple calendars entirely. They meant well. They spoke of yields and of efficiency and of feeding a growing population. For a few years, it seemed to work. Then the pests arrived in great numbers, because the fields were all planted at once now, and the water began to be misdirected, because the old rhythm of synchronized fallows had been broken. Crops failed. Farmers grew quietly worried in the way that farmers do, which is to say without much fuss, but with a new watchfulness in their eyes. And slowly, gently, the old ways returned, because the old ways had been right all along. The priests at Ulun Danu Batur resumed their quiet task of coordinating the plantings. The water temples reclaimed their place in the calendar. The rice came back. And when the outside world finally ran its computer simulations and saw what the temples had been doing, it had the grace to be quietly humbled. But we should not rush ahead of ourselves. There is more water to follow, and the night is long. Let us drift, then, to another of the great water temples, a place called Pura Ulun Danu Beratan. It lies a little to the west of Batur, at the edge of another mountain lake, in a region the Balinese call Bedugal. The air here is cooler than almost anywhere else on the island, often 15 or 20 degrees cooler than the coast, and in the early mornings, a soft mist lies over the surface of the lake like a pulled sheet. The temple seems, at first sight, to be floating. Its main shrines have been built on small islands just offshore, and when the water is high, the pagodas with their tiered thatched roofs appear to rise directly out of the lake, their reflections shivering below them. It was built in 1633 by a king of the Mengwi dynasty, a ruler called Igusti Agung Pudu, and it was dedicated, as so many water temples were, to Dewi Danu. He chose the location because it was understood to be a place where three sacred elements came together: mountain, lake, and sky. The mist makes the meeting of these elements visible. You can see the sky sitting on the water and the water sitting on the mountain, and the mountain disappearing into the sky, all at once. And for a moment, the ordinary boundaries between things dissolve into a soft gray quiet. Farmers from the surrounding Subaks still come here to ask for water. Before the planting and before the harvest, and at the small anniversaries of the temple that come around every 210 days in the Balinese calendar, they arrive in their best clothes, carrying tall, swaying towers of fruit and flowers and cakes on their heads. The women walk first, their backs straight, their steps slow, and even so that the offerings will not tumble. The men follow. Children, in sarongs too long for them and freshly combed hair, trail along the edges of the procession. At the temple, they make their offerings and sit cross-legged on the stones of the outer courtyard, and a priest, a pemanku, walks among them with a small silver bowl of holy water, dipping a flower into it and flicking cool droplets onto their heads. The droplets smell faintly of flowers and of something older, a faint mineral memory of stone and rain. It is a small act, lasting only a moment for each person, and yet it ties the farmer and the field and the lake and the mountain together in a single gesture, a single sentence in a conversation that has been going on since long before anyone in the courtyard was born. There is a third lake temple, less famous than the others, and for that reason perhaps the loveliest to visit in the imagination. It stands at Lake Tamblingan, tucked into a highland forest where the trees close over the trail, and the air smells of wet leaves and damp earth. This is Pura Ulun Danu Tamblingan, and it is quieter than its sisters in every sense. Fewer pilgrims come. Fewer cameras flash. The stone walls of the temple are softened by moss that has been growing on them for generations, and the thatched roofs of the small meru have darkened almost to black with age and rain. To walk there is to feel how the Subak network was never only about the large, dramatic places. It was also about the smaller ones, the quiet corners of the forest where a handful of farmers tended a handful of fields and kept a handful of shrines clean, and remembered the name of a goddess who rarely had the world's attention. All of these temples, great and small, were understood to be part of the same family. Water that was blessed at Tamblingan or at Beratan was, in its invisible way, still connected to the lake at the top of the world on the rim of Batur. Let us come down the mountain now, for the water is going that way, and the land is beginning to change beneath it. As the water leaves the high lakes and their surrounding temples, it enters the middle country, the green belt of the island where the terraces begin in earnest. This is where we should linger longest tonight, because this is where the Subak is most visible to the eye and most alive to the touch. The most celebrated of these landscapes is a place called Jatiluwih, which sits on the southern slopes of Mount Badukaru in the Tabanan Regency, at about 700 meters above the sea. The name itself means, in Balinese, something like truly marvelous, from the words Jati and Luwi. Truly and good. And when you stand on one of the small wooden platforms above the fields and let your eyes travel across the terraces, you begin to understand why that name has been in use for as long as anyone can remember. The hills have been shaped into long, sweeping curves of green, tier after tier, following the natural contours of the slopes. The rice, depending on the season, may be the pale blue-green of young plants, or the bright emerald of the middle weeks, or the heavy gold of the grains just before harvest. Water glints here and there between the stalks, catching the light. Small wooden huts with thatched roofs, built for farmers to rest in and for tools to be kept out of the rain, stand at the corners of the fields. A shrine, just a simple tall stone carved with a few symbols, marks one of the water inlets. Smoke from a cooking fire rises, slow and straight, from somewhere down in the valley. Jatiluwih today is the home of the largest of the 20 Subaks that have been placed under the protection of UNESCO, as part of the World Heritage recognition granted in 2012. That Subak alone has more than 500 members. Its fields cover more than 600 hectares, which is almost 1,500 acres, although the larger cultural landscape around it extends far beyond that. The smallest of the protected Subaks, a place called Bedtime, has only about 90 members, a little village family of farmers tending their fields in the shadow of a mountain. Together, these communities still do what their ancestors did. They still grow traditional Balinese rice in some of their paddies, a slower crop than the modern varieties, without the help of chemical fertilizers or pesticides, depending on the old rhythms of the temple calendar and the old ecological wisdom of synchronized plantings and deliberate fallows. The paddies still shine in the early morning like scattered pieces of mirror. The herons still come. The farmers still walk the buns with bare feet, feeling the mud for the small messages it sends them about how the water is moving. To walk through Jatiluwih in the early hours is to enter a kind of gentle trance. The trails wind along the tops of the buns, narrow earthen walls between one paddy and the next, and you have to walk slowly and carefully because the ground is often a little slippery, and because there is nothing in particular to hurry toward. A farmer might pass you, carrying a small bundle of harvested stalks on his shoulder, and he will give you a slight nod, the quiet nod of someone who has seen many passers-by and has nothing to prove to any of them. A dog, perhaps, will trot along beside you for a few paces and then drift off down another path. The canals murmur constantly on either side of the trail, small voices having a small, endless conversation, and every so often you come upon a bamboo pipe that has been laid across a cutting carrying water from one field to another, a simple bridge of hollowed plant doing the work of any aqueduct. There is almost no machinery to be seen. There are almost no raised voices. The air is soft and smells faintly of mud and of something like cut grass, and the sky, when you look up, is an enormous quiet bowl of pale blue above the green. You might come across a farmer performing what is called nampadin, the cleaning of the field, or nandur, the planting of the young rice seedlings. Planting is done by hand, bent over at the waist, pressing each small green tuft into the mud with the thumb. A row of people moves slowly backward across the paddy, leaving behind them a field newly stitched with life. Up to their ankles in warm water, their hats wide enough to cast a circle of shade, They speak to each other in soft voices, sometimes laughing, sometimes humming a half-remembered song. Watching them, you understand that this is not a picturesque survival of a lost age. It is simply work, being done by people whose grandparents did it and whose grandchildren, if the island is kind to them, may also do it in their turn. The picturesque quality is something the rest of us have brought with us. The work itself is old and ordinary, and in its own small way, eternal. Before the planting begins, and before the harvest is gathered, and at many moments in between, offerings must be made. This is perhaps the most visible sign, to a visitor, of how deeply the Subak is woven into the religious life of the island. Small shrines are scattered everywhere among the fields. Some are only a little taller than a person's waist, carved out of simple stone. Others stand on tall stilts at the corners of the terraces, with tiny thatched roofs. Each morning, a farmer or his wife will place a fresh canning sari at one of these shrines. A canning sari is a tiny woven tray made from a single banana leaf, filled with colored flower petals, a pinch of rice, a crumb of incense, sometimes a small biscuit or a sliver of fruit. It is no bigger than the palm of a hand. And yet across the whole island of Bali, tens of millions of these small offerings are made every single day, at house gates and at shop entrances and at rice fields and at bends in the road where a certain spirit is known to live. The Subak farmers make theirs to thank Dewi Danu for the water and to ask her to keep it coming, and to honor the countless smaller spirits who are understood to inhabit the land. The smoke of the incense rises for a moment and then drifts away, and the farmer walks back to the house, and the flowers stay behind, slowly fading in the sun. By evening, the offering will be gone, and a new one will be made the next day. The ritual is so small that it is almost invisible, and so constant that it is almost the rhythm of the island's breathing. The terraces themselves are older than any of the temples standing in them now. Some of the field patterns at Jatiluwih and in the neighboring Subaks of the Kachur Anga Badukaru landscape are mentioned in a Balinese inscription from the 10th century, which means the shape of the land where those farmers work today is the same shape their ancestors were working 1,000 years ago. You can stand on a ridge and try to imagine that. 1,000 harvests, 1,000 plantings, 1,000 blessings of the water, generations of children learning to walk on the same buns, generations of elders sitting beneath the same small pavilions to watch the sun set behind the same mountain. There is something in that thought that is almost the opposite of loneliness, a sense of being held in a very long, very patient embrace by people you will never meet. As the water continues down from Jatiluwih, it flows through the Pakaraisen Valley, a river valley south of the lakes that is thought to hold the oldest known irrigation channels on the island. Here, the Subak meets the wider history of ancient Bali. Along the banks of the Pakaraisen River, you can still find monuments carved directly into the living rock. There is Gunung Kawi, a set of 11th century royal shrines hewn into the cliffs at either side of the river. You reach them by walking down a long flight of stone steps between high green walls of rice terraces and forest. And when you arrive at the bottom, the shapes emerge from the rock slowly, each about 7 meters tall, their forms softened by centuries of rain and moss. They are called Kandi, the memorials of kings, and the water that once ran past them and runs past them still has fed the paddies of the people who lived under those kings, and then under every other arrangement of rulers that has come and gone in the centuries since. The kings passed. The Subak did not. The water kept moving through the valley whether there was a palace on the hill or not, and the farmers kept making their offerings at the small temples by the river, and the morning mist still rises off the water in the coolest hour before dawn, just as it did then. Not far from Gunung Kawi, on the same little river, stands Pura Tirta Empul. This is the Holy Spring Temple, founded in the year 962 during the Warmadwa dynasty, more than 1,000 years ago. Its name means simply the temple of the spring that rises from the ground, and the spring is still there, still bubbling up clean and cold from the stone at the heart of the compound. According to an old story, the spring was created by the god Indra during a battle with a cruel king who had poisoned his soldiers. Indra struck the earth with his staff, and the waters rose, and his soldiers drank from them and were healed. Whether or not you believe the story, the shape of it has stayed with the temple for 1,000 years. People come here to be healed. They come for the ritual known as Melukat, the purification in water. They wear a plain sarong and stand in the stone pool beneath a row of carved waterspouts, each spout fed by the spring, and they move slowly from one spout to the next, bowing their heads under each cool rush of water in turn, murmuring a prayer, then stepping to the next. There can be 30 spouts in all. The water is cold in the early morning, and the stones of the pool are smooth from the feet of countless pilgrims. A few candles burn along the edges. A priest in a white cloth sits on a low platform, watching, occasionally offering a quiet blessing. Fish move slowly in the pool on the far side, where the spring itself bubbles up from the sand at the bottom like a small continuous handful of pearls. From the spring of Tirta Empul, the water joins the pack horizon and then the other rivers of the island, and eventually, much later, it reaches the sea. By that time, it has passed through the hands of many Subaks. It has filled many paddies. It has been blessed at many temples, small and large, nearly invisible and world-famous. It has irrigated the rice that will feed a family in a village, and also the rice that will be carried in the basket of a woman to a great ceremony at a royal temple. And somewhere in the middle distance of its journey, it has likely passed through the grounds of one more temple we should not leave out of tonight's walk. Pura Taman Ayun, in the village of Mengwi, is sometimes called the Royal Water Temple, and it was built in the 17th century by the same king who built the floating temple at Beratan, I Gusti Agung Pudu of the Mengwi dynasty. The name means the beautiful garden, and it deserves the name. The whole compound is surrounded by a wide moat, and around the moat lie lawns planted with flowering trees, and the soft sound of water is everywhere. Inside, rows of tall meru rise against the sky, each with its layered black thatched roofs, 9 and 11 and 7 tiers high depending on the importance of the god to whom it is dedicated. In the 17th and 18th centuries, this was the central temple of the largest and most powerful kingdom on Bali, and its ritual authority extended to the full reach of the Subak network within its borders. Kings and priests walked here together. Farmers came too on the great days. Today, anyone may enter, and on an ordinary weekday afternoon, there are long moments when you can stand in the outer courtyard with no sound at all, except the wind in the high thatch and a dove calling somewhere from the frangipani trees. All of these temples, from the highest at Batter to the lowest by the sea, were bound together by the quiet logic of the water. The Subak farmers of each valley, each slope, each small cluster of fields made their decisions in meetings at the village meeting hall, the Bail Banjar, a simple open pavilion of wood and thatch where everyone sat on the floor. The meetings were led by a Pekese, sometimes also called a Kelihan Subak, the chairman of the cooperative. He was not a chief in any strong sense of the word. He was a neighbor who had been entrusted for a time with the responsibility of remembering how the water was to be shared and of gently holding people to their agreements. Decisions were made by consensus. If a farmer's canal needed repairing, a day was chosen, and everyone came to help, and the work was done together. If a dispute arose about how much water a particular field was receiving, it was talked over in the meeting until a solution was found that nobody was happy with, but nobody was angry about either, which is often the sign of a good solution. If a farmer broke the rules of the Subak too badly and too often, he could be fined, or in the oldest days even cast out, though this almost never happened because the rules were not imposed from above. They belonged to everyone. Above each meeting, and inside each meeting in a quiet way, was the temple. Every Subak had its own shrine, a small Baal Agung at a convenient place along the water's path. Ceremonies were held there to mark every stage of the rice cycle, from the first flooding of the field to the offering of the very first grains to the goddess. The same calendar that ran the spiritual life of the village also ran the ecological life of the village. It was a single, unified piece of knowledge that had been folded together so carefully and so long ago that you could no longer tell where the religion ended and the engineering began. They had become the same thing. There is something soothing, I think, in considering how quietly all this worked. There was no grand empire behind it. There was no central bureau of water, no ministry of agriculture in a distant city issuing decrees. There was a lake and a goddess and a line of volcanoes and a patient network of people who trusted each other enough to measure their sharing in fingers' widths and their time in the cycles of a goddess's feast days. The terraces of Jatiluwih were not built by an army of slaves under the command of a cruel prince. They were built a little at a time, year by year, by the very families who then farmed them, using simple tools and the knowledge of 100 generations before them. The stones of the weirs were set by hand. The tunnels were dug with the faith that the water would eventually come out the other side. The shrines were carved in the spare hours of evening. The whole magnificent, World Heritage, UNESCO-protected cultural landscape of Bali was built at something very close to the pace of a human heart at rest. Come, let us walk one last little while along the water before the night is done. The moon has risen by now. though you cannot see it from where you are, and the paddies of Jatiluwih are full of its pale silver. The rice plants lean very slightly in a soft wind that you cannot feel on your skin, but can see in the way the reflections tremble. A single gecko calls from a thatched roof. A dog, half asleep on a doorstep somewhere in the village below, lifts its head and lowers it again. In the small shrine at the corner of the field, the offering that was placed there this morning has mostly gone soft with the day's heat, and the flowers have faded, and the pinch of rice has been taken by the ants. Tomorrow, a new one will replace it. The old priests knew something that we in the louder parts of the world sometimes forget. They knew that the things that last the longest are very rarely the things that shout. They are the things that move softly, patiently, in the same direction as gravity and kindness and water. A stone weir, slowly worn smooth by a stream. A tiny offering, placed without ceremony by a woman on her way to market. A meeting of farmers in a pavilion at the edge of a rice field, held at the end of a long afternoon, and ending not in anger but in the quiet nodding of heads. A goddess who does not demand but who is thanked. A mountain that lets its water go, not because it is asked to, but because that is what mountains do. A lake that holds the sky inside itself every morning as a courtesy to the day. Somewhere on the rim of the Batter caldera, the wind moves through the thatch of the 11-tiered Meru that once survived a river of lava, and the priests sleep in their small houses nearby, and the lake lies dark and very still beneath them. Somewhere at Beratan, the mist is beginning to gather again above the water, and the floating pagodas are already disappearing gently into it, as if the lake were folding them carefully away for the night. Somewhere at Tamblingan, the forest is loud with insects and quiet with everything else, and the old moss-covered walls of the temple hold the shape of centuries inside them. Somewhere on the slopes of Badukaru, in the terraces of Jatiluwih, a canal whispers to itself in the dark, dividing its small share of the mountain's gift between one field and another, according to the old, patient agreement, and the young rice drinks in silence. Somewhere in the valley of the pack horizon, the spring at Tirta Empul bubbles up the way it has bubbled up for more than 1,000 years, clean and cold and constant, and a few fallen petals turn slowly on its surface. And somewhere still further down, the water is joining the river, and the river is joining the sea, and the sea will send it up again, in time, as cloud, as rain, as a new beginning. There is nothing, really, to do with any of this, except to let it be and to rest. The Balinese farmers who shaped these terraces would recognize the feeling, I think. They worked hard, but they also trusted the slowness of things. They trusted the water to know its way. They trusted the goddess to keep her promises. They trusted each other, which may have been the most remarkable trust of all. And when the day's work was done, they sat in the pavilion at the edge of the field, watching the last of the light leave the top of the mountain, and they let the evening come. Let the evening come for you now, too. Let the soft sound of that mountain water carry you. Let the terraces step gently down into the dark below your thoughts, one field into the next, one silver pond after another, quieter and quieter. Let the small shrines at their corners keep their small flames for you. Let the old priests tend to the lake. Let the wind move through the thatch. Let Dewi Danu, if you like, keep watch over the slow turning of the world while you sleep. Thank you for spending this quiet hour beside the water with us, here at the Bedtime Lore. May your night be as gentle as a Kanang sari placed with care, as patient as a weir worn smooth by 1,000 years of stream, as generous as a mountain giving its water to the fields. Rest well now, and let these ancient green terraces carry you softly into dreams. Good night.